Last video, we talked about Napoleon at the height of his power. And this is the map we ended on, where we see the full extent of Napoleon's empire. All of Spain, France, what is now Holland, the Netherlands, Belgium, most of what is now Germany, all of what is now Italy. Basically, all of Western Europe was either part of Napoleon's empire or allied to Napoleon's empire. But even on this map that shows Napoleon at the height of his power, we see what started the process that led to his downfall. If you look at this little green arrow here that says invasion of Russia 1812. That's where things started going badly for Napoleon, and it was all his fault. In 1812, Napoleon was fine. He still had the British to beat, and to do that, he had set up what was called the Continental System, where he basically banned all trade with Britain. And he was trying to destroy the British economy to get them to come to terms with him. He was really upset, though, because a lot of people still wanted to trade with Great Britain. And one of the major people who wanted to trade with Britain was Russia. Russia got a lot of its important manufactured goods from Britain. Britain was one of the main sources for Russian exports. That means Russia sold Britain a lot of stuff. So the continental system was hurting Russia, and Russia decided to drop out of it. And this upset Napoleon so much that he decided to invade Russia to teach them a lesson. So at the very height of his power, he got together an army of 400,000 Frenchmen and 250,000 others and invaded Russia. And things did not go according to plan. One of the first things that went wrong was the Russians did fight some battles, but and there were a few times when Napoleon, if things had gone perfectly for him, could have probably defeated the Russian armies. But for the most part, the Russians just retreated as Napoleon invaded after the first few battles. And they did not only retreat, they burned all the fields with their grain in them. They killed any animals they couldn't take with them. They laid waste to their entire countryside. This is in Russia. The Russians burned their own fields and killed or took their animals with them so that Napoleon's men would have very little to eat. And so if you remember, I talked about in an earlier video how one of the keys to the French army's success was, or Napoleon's success, was rapid movement. And one of the ways he did this was that he lived off the land, as they say. This means he did not have huge trains of wagons to transport supplies because that would have slowed his army down. So his men could not do that in Russia. And so a lot of Napoleon's men faced starvation, and he reached Moscow. But as the Russian winter set in, he realized that he could not win. He had to retreat. Even after he reached Moscow, the Russians didn't stay and fight. They kept retreating. They gave him their capital city. So Napoleon started his retreat, and the Russian winter is brutal. And it has saved Russia from invasion multiple times. Before Napoleon was defeated by the Russian winter, the King of Sweden, Charles the 12th, was defeated by the Russian winter when he invaded Russia, and in the a little over 100 years before Napoleon did. And as we will see next chapter, Hitler was defeated by the Russian winter as well. So Napoleon's men, many of them were weak from lack of supplies, started straggling behind, freezing to death in the Russian winter. And this was a horrible situation. If you were a straggler, if you were weakened because you were sick because of the winter, if you were both sick and starving because there wasn't enough food and you couldn't keep up with the rest of the army, Russian villagers would often ambush you and kill you. The worst fear was these guys. These are the Cossacks. These were Russian horsemen who basically, they're from what is now the Ukraine. And they, if they could catch stragglers, they were vicious fighters. They often, if you were in a body of your fellow soldiers and you stood in the line and shot at them, the Cossacks would run away. But if you were running, if your line was broken and you were retreating, or if you were a straggler, you did not want to meet these guys. So by the time Napoleon left Russia, only 93,000 men remained in his army. This is one of the most catastrophic defeats in military history. And again, none of this had to be done. Napoleon could have easily made peace with Russia if he'd wanted to, and relaxed his terms and decided that he did not have to force Great Britain to submit to him. But Napoleon, like so many other of the greatest generals in history, was so successful that he started thinking he was unbeatable. This map shows you the numbers Napoleon had. Here is his numbers at the start. The Niemen River is, at that point was, I believe it's in Poland, was considered the border of Russia. So this represents how many men he had as he advanced into Russia, and the beige line is how many men he has he retreated. The smaller the line gets, the smaller the number of people. Now you might be wondering, wait, these numbers don't match up. You said 655,000 and 93,000. Not quite sure why that is. I do know that the number of Frenchmen in his army was around 400,000. So I think this map, which I believe was originally made by a Frenchman, was counting French soldiers. So you can see by the time he left Russia, he had 10,000 French soldiers left. So all along the way here, you can see the numbers just shrinking: 96, 87, 55, 37, 24. These all represent men killed in battle. These represent men lagging behind because they're weak from lack of food, or they're sick and getting killed by Cossacks and Russian villagers. These all represent just ambushes and so on that defeated Napoleon. And also you can see here, I don't think this, actually this was included in the original, I think. Here you can see the temperature. Might be a little hard for us to translate it into Fahrenheit, but you can see the temperature dropping. 0 in Celsius is freezing, and the temperature drops progressively. So you can see as the temperature fell, Napoleon's numbers fell. So that was the beginning of the end, and Napoleon was drastically weakened. His whole thing of being an invincible general was shattered, and a lot of Frenchmen had died because of his unnecessary invasion. And the second thing that brought Napoleon down was the Battle of Nations, also called the Battle of Leipzig, where Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Sweden all banded together and defeated Napoleon. Here is a painting of the Battle of Leipzig. You can see the city of Leipzig in the background. one of the interesting things in this battle that was disastrous for Napoleon was that as his men were retreating through the city to get away, there was a bridge across the river. I think you can see the river right here, that was set with explosives and was supposed to be blown up after Napoleon's army had retreated across it so that the other armies couldn't follow. Unfortunately, the bridge was blown up before a big chunk of Napoleon's army could make it across. So Napoleon's enemies got far more prisoners than they would have if the bridge had been blown at the right time. So after the Battle of Leipzig, Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Sweden, who, by the way, were being financed by Britain. Britain did not have many soldiers at this point. They had tiny armies compared to the other countries, but they had lots of money. And so they paid huge amounts of money to these countries to fight Napoleon. So these countries invaded France, and Napoleon was forced to step down, and he was exiled to the island of Elba. Now, exiled, he was basically given Elba as his own mini kingdom. Here is Elba right here. So if you remember the last map, Napoleon went from ruling one of the biggest empires in European history to ruling this tiny little island. And that kept him happy for about a year. He actually was a really good administrator, and he did lots of things to improve stuff on Elba, improve taxes, started building lots of new roads and aqueducts and so on, but he just was not happy. And so what really rankled, and this is sort of the final irony of the revolution, Louis XVIII, who was Louis XVI's brother, who had fled France during the revolution, Louis XVIII was made king at the Congress of Vienna. This is where Russia and Britain and Austria and Prussia and all the victorious kingdoms got together and decided what they divided up Europe, basically. Many of the borders of Europe to this day are based on the Congress of Vienna. And one of the things the Congress did was it made Louis XVIII king. And so Napoleon, there's a picture of Louis XVIII. You can see that they've come a long way since Louis XIV. So this really rankled Napoleon. This got tired of just being king of this tiny little island of Elba. And so on March 20, 1815, he had set up a bunch of detailed plans. It took him several weeks to plan this. He snuck on board a ship and returned to France. And poor Louis XVIII was not a very popular king. So when Napoleon returned to France, men flocked to him. The French army, most of them, when they heard Napoleon was back, rushed to join him. And this even included some army units that Louis XVIII would have assumed would stop Napoleon. So Napoleon was back, and he had his army again. He returned to his old quarters in the Tuileries in Paris, but everyone else was not having it. And the British, the Austrians, and the Prussians all got together, and at the Battle of Waterloo on June 18th, 1815, they defeated Napoleon decisively. And Waterloo, by the way, is named for a tiny Belgian village called Waterloo. So in this battle, the British actually did fight. Before this, the reason they weren't fighting Napoleon before this, they were just funding people fighting him. The British had most of their soldiers in Spain. So the British army at Waterloo was the smallest of the armies compared to the Austrians and Prussians, but they still contributed, and that British general, the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellington, was the leader. of the combined forces. After Waterloo, Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena. Now, this was not a little mini kingdom like Elba had been. He was exiled there and basically not quite house arrest. He could move around to some extent, but largely confined to his living quarters. And the British were so suspicious that they had ships patrolling the whole time. They searched every single vessel that docked at St. Helena. Packages sent to Napoleon were opened suspiciously. Lots of stuff was confiscated from him by the British soldiers that were keeping guard of Napoleon. So they were making sure he was not going to escape and pull another Waterloo. So 6 years after Waterloo, 6 years in St. Helena, Napoleon died of stomach cancer. And that brought the career of one of Europe's, or I should say, history's greatest generals to an end.